Thank you everyone for tuning into this webinar series that's presented by C-DEBI. It focuses on professional development skills needed both in and out of academia. This series is held every other month, so stay tuned for our next seminar, which will be held in June. And please tune in to our 2018 Networked Speaker Series with Dr. Alma Parada from Stanford University speaking on May 31st. Before I start, I will review some webinar reminders and tips. This webinar is being recorded. You will be muted during the talk, so if you have a question, please use the chat box. And you can enter questions at any time, but we will save the questions until the end. Today's speaker is Dr. Ben Tully, C-DEBI Bioinformatics Specialist, and he will be talking about the joys of open science. And with that, I will turn it over to Ben. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everybody. Let's just jump into this. So I wanted to start off with this question about how open science might be related to professional development, because I'm not sure if it's something that people necessarily connect together as something that is professional development. At C-DEBI and as part of this series, we normally classify professional development as a career-relevant topic that normally lacks formal training. Maybe you're very lucky in your institution where talking about open science happens in a very formal setting. But for the most part, it seems to be something that is normally discussed still just as it's happening, as it's progressing in the field at large. How it also relates is that, as a scientist, your data are your career. And so that doesn't necessarily mean the actual raw information that you create, but it also includes your manuscripts, the way you interact with the community, all of your extra activities that you do as part of a scientist, and having that information somewhere and accessible is generally a good way of making sure that your career is moving forward. And that the open science principles actually can help increase visibility for all aspects of your career. And for the most part, and you may disagree with this, but visibility can definitely drive your future prospects. And so that's why we're talking about open science and how it relates to your professional development. So first thing I did, or not the first thing, but a little closer to the start of this conversation that we're having in this webinar, I wanted to ask the larger scientific community what they thought. And so I went to Twitter and I reached out to a few people who I knew were large proponents of open science, but asked them, what's your favorite point to ask and to point out to people about open science? What are the aspects of it? So you'll see throughout the talk elements from this Twitter conversation that occurred, where you'll see the tweets and then a little bit of a bio just to the side of the tweet so that the people who are making the points are getting the credit that they deserve. So the first response that we got for this was from John Tennant about how open science is just good science. And so that's it. I think that really just solves our problem here about why we should be participating in open science. Thank you for coming to the webinar, and that was good. I'll be taking questions now. Obviously, that's not the case, and it's really terrible telling a joke to a room by yourself. So I'm just assuming everybody who's listening to this is laughing uncontrollably, and I'm sorry that you had so much fun with that joke. So I wanted to talk about. So this is a really recent white paper that came out recently from Springer Nature, where they surveyed 7,000 researchers worldwide to ask about how they're sharing data when it comes along with publications. And so there's a lot more information here than these couple of tidbits that I pulled out, but I did want to highlight a couple things. So as part of C-DEBI, we generally fall within the categories of earth sciences and biological sciences, the two bar graphs on the side here and the top graph. And for the most part, we're doing pretty okay. People are putting their data either in their supplementary information or in a repository so that people can get access to it after the fact. But there are fairly large portions of both the biological sciences and earth sciences, ranging from like a quarter to a third, where you're just not, researchers aren't putting their data anywhere. And that should be troubling, and it's a little concerning just to think about that on the scale of how much data might be missing when we go to access it at some point in the future. The second part to point out was that this disparity between how leading researchers, as defined by Springer Nature, perceive that they have less time to participate in the actual depositing and sharing of data than first stage researchers as they're classified, which maybe makes sense. Graduate students and postdocs tend to have a little bit more time than their PIs, but at the same time, if that is the case and it's falling on the shoulders of early career researchers, these are the individuals who have the least knowledge. They don't know what repository to put it into, and that can range from anything from domain-specific repositories not knowing what to do, and also more modern open science repositories. And then the last tidbit that really shocked me the most was that it's not the large data sets that are missing from the overall broad picture of what's happening here. It's actually the small data sets. Stuff that's less than 20 megabytes in size have the highest probability of not being included anywhere, up 42%. So that means like the things that are the most important potentially to help translate your research into something that somebody can follow up on in a future study is not there, right? It's great that people are putting their large data sets somewhere, but it's the small stuff sometimes that can really make it easy to get access to. And so they had two conclusions about what could be done. One would be to support good data management at early career stages, which hopefully this webinar will be part of. And number two is to have faster, easier routes for sharing data. I'm not going to be able to touch on any of that. That's much more on the other side of this conversation, not the researchers themselves. And so one of the areas that I wanted to touch on were these new principles that were released late last year called the FAIR Guiding Principles for Scientific Data. You can follow up with the DOI here if you want to read the full report in Scientific Data. And so if you haven't seen this acronym before, FAIR stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable. And we've gotten to these four terms through a collaboration, not just of academia, but of academia, industry, funding agencies, and publishers. And it's an effort to preserve long-term care of valuable digital assets. And so this is good, and this is probably something that, part of the reason why open science is now something that is a little bit more oriented towards the mainstream, is that it's not just academics pushing this, but it is funding agencies and publishers requiring more and more rigorous ways of making sure that data is available for people when the publication is released. And so what do the FAIR principles describe? So that it's a concise, domain-independent, high-level principles that can be applied to a wide range of outputs. And so just to give you an idea of what this looks like, so here's FAIR here, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. Findable just these are almost self-explanatory, but I will go over them just a little bit. So findable includes having a unique, persistent identifier with rich metadata in a searchable database, right? So this is, coming at this generally from a perspective of microbial genomics. This includes making sure that your raw sequences are in the right database with a number that can be searchable, and then when somebody searches it, it's present there. Accessible means that using that identifier, somebody can find the data and then through standard computational protocols, get access to that data. Not necessarily always the case. Sometimes data needs to be private for certain reasons, especially in the biomedical field, where patients' information can be associated with the data, at which point then you need to have some way of authenticating it. But then at the same time, even when somebody can't get to the raw data in those instances, they should be able to get to the metadata to make sure that they have an understanding of what it is that may or may not be present in that data set. Interoperable is specifically relating to making sure that you're using languages that are able to be understood by computers, so that you can automate these processes and not require always human interaction. And so, this requires having specific vocabularies, which you can read more about from the FAIR group as they're putting these forward. And then lastly, maybe the ribbon that ties this all together is that what you present in your data and what you make public needs to be reusable in some way. It needs to have accurate, relevant attributes with a clear license, right? And so this gets a little into some interesting areas here of making sure that you have the right license so that it can be used either universally if it's an academic data, or maybe putting some limits on the commercialization of it. This is something that is an internal discussion a lot of times for labs, but it's something to understand. Detailed provenance, so now how did you get the data? Where did it come from? What work did you do to it before you dropped it into a repository? And then make sure that all of it meets domain relevant standards. And so I've included in the next couple slides where I've looking at some aspects of open science, how these actually fall into these categories, and you can see them at the bottom of your screen in the bottom right corner, just by indicated by the letters of the FAIR acronym. So the first thing I wanted to touch on was open methods, and so we have this tweet here from Lenny, who may be a little biased in the methods website that I'm going to be presenting here, Protocols.io, because he's the co-founder, so he's probably very excited that that's what we're talking about here. But if you publish Lenny says, if you publish a method that you want others to use, sharing the detailed step-by-step protocol means people are more likely to get it to work and less likely to bug you because it doesn't. This increases trust in your publication and your credibility as a science. As an opinion, I have to agree that that probably is the case. And having that accessibility to your methods in a clear, concise way makes it so that everybody's doing less work on the grand scheme of things. And so the example that I have here for open methods is Protocols.io. And so, like I said, Lenny is the co-founder of Protocols.io. And I wanted to show an example of a computational methodology that is from our lab. And one of the great things about Protocols.io is it gives you this step-by-step breakdown of how to produce things, and that you can then track as you go, clicking off things that tell you how far along you are in your step process. It also allows you to, when you're using somebody else's method, to split that method off and add notes to it as you go, make modifications so that you can keep track of it. And then it also keeps track of who's visited and what they've seen from it, right? So for this method here, presented here, since it was released in 2017, you can see this gradual increase in the cumulative number of people who have looked at these methods, and we know in general how pervasive it is going out into the community. And so Protocols.io provides a citable DOI, allowing a fixed point that you can add to a paper that people can click on and reference exactly what you're talking about when you're talking about your methods. It allows version control, so if you do your method once and you get some new samples and you make some modifications, you can actually just update the version, so you have version 1 into version 2. There's a record of the comments between users and the protocol developer. So if something's not working for somebody can make a comment about it, you can respond, and then the next person who has that problem doesn't have to contact you again, which just saves time overall. And then there's also on the side of it that is accessible, you don't have to make these methods public. You can use these Protocols.io to make collaborative methods for labs and having lab notebooks where you can formalize your protocols in a way that makes it harder to lose and more readily available for students in the future and postdocs and people coming into the lab. From open methods, we go to open data. And so there's lots of repositories that are public and domain specific. Again, I'm very familiar with the microbial genomics side of things. And so things like NCBI, which are open to the public, you can get access to data from lots of things. But there are other repositories that are great for housing data that either is not recognized in standard repositories or can't fit in supplemental information. One of the examples that I like to use for this from the microbial genomic perspective is sometimes, it's very often that people are making phylogenetic trees of genes of interest, and you end up with these trees that have these really nice figures that end up in your publication, but it isn't always easy to share with people the specific genes that you were using, the actual specific sequences, or the actual output that allows somebody to replicate and look at the figure that you've generated in your publication. And so these types of open data repositories actually allow that type of information to be shared in a way that people can get at. Putting it in a supplemental sometimes doesn't work because you end up with these documents that you've put in some file format that really just isn't ideal to be in a Word document or in a PDF. It really makes sense for it to be in a plain text file. And so on the very low end, if we're talking about the type of data, the 20 megabytes of data that's missing, these repositories are great for that. It also works in the other sense with really large data sets that may not be able to be housed in specific domain repositories, which we have some experience with in our lab. The other thing that I found just in doing the research for this presentation is that for these particular databases, Zendo, Dryad, Mendeley Data, and a couple others, they actually share a shared search space, so that when you search in one, you can actually see data in all the other ones, increasing their findability, accessibility, and interoperability. And so why do you want to share your data? So this is a paper from PLOS One from looking back at a distribution of citations from trials in biomedical research. And so there's a little bit of caveats about the types of fields we're working in and types of papers. But even when you take the data between papers that have shared data and non-shared data for both all of the papers that they looked at and then the ones that are in lower impact journals exclusively, lower impact here being 25 because we're talking about biomedical research, you can see that there's actually a significant increase in the number of citations for manuscripts for publications that share their data. If you look at the full data set, including the high impact ones, it's almost 5 times as many citations on average, while the number comes down a little bit when you're just looking at comparing papers on the same scale of perceived impact factor. So that's maybe why you want to share your data. There's also the avenues that we want to take to make sure that the publications that we're presenting are open. So I'm going to talk a little bit about preprints and open journals, but you can see there's like a fairly large exchange happening here on Twitter about this. And so Nate Jacobs writes here that the favorite tidbit about publishing open means your work is available to all researchers. Imagine if your tweets, blog, website only were available to the few rich people. It'd be very silly. Most researchers worldwide don't have access to traditional legacy publishers, to which Holly Bick responded and pointed out that a lot of times congressional staffers point out how much having open access papers really means to policy making, because a lot of times your legislators do not have access to subscription journals, which is a little, that's a little, disturbing and something that we want to be part of. The other aspect of it from Gareth here is how about taxpayers should have access to the research they fund? Let's open the door to the ivory tower. And so this is one of those aspects of it that, as a taxpayer myself, this makes a ton of sense. There's the number of times that I'm not on a university Wi-Fi or a university system where a paper comes across that I, at the very minimum would like to read some of the introductions and methodologies that you then are limited because it's behind a paywall. It's actually fairly high for myself personally, and as a taxpayer, that's a little frustrating. So if we switch to how do we get this information out in a public manner, so that there are 2 really big avenues I want to talk about. Is preprints, and so the various preprint servers. So here are 3 examples for biology, bioRxiv, PeerJ preprints, and ASP Bio, which allow you to publish your data before peer review. And so there are the caveats that go along with this. Without peer review, you can have issues where people are presenting data that might not be 100%, but at the same time, it becomes one of those situations of, as researchers, we should be actively thinking about the publications that we're reading and judging them on their quality as we're going. And I think that for most individuals and scientists, preprints are a point that allow people just access at an earlier stage and allow them to make the judgments themselves and allow the data to get out faster. There are so many times that you look at manuscripts that have submission dates years before they're actually available through the final publication. And preprints help to get the data out faster to more people without that caveat. The other point, and so I'm going to be sharing these slides on Twitter if you want to follow and you want to get access slides. So this actually is a hot link for a list of open access journals on Wikipedia. And so these are journals that are specifically open access. They're available to everyone. They're open to the public. That's not to say that there aren't options in subscription-based journals where researchers can normally pay a little bit more to make a manuscript public as soon as it's published, as opposed to waiting to maybe after some delay. And so, from the aspect of preprinting, why would you want to maybe preprint if what supports that? So this is a paper from this year from JAMA, which compared 776 preprints with publications matched to a set of publications without preprints. And they found that papers with preprints had significantly higher Altmetric scores and more citations. And so you can see that the citations is, maybe not a huge advantage, but it's 4 to 3 is still significant for the average paper. The big difference here is the Altmetric scores. And so Altmetric is this online company that keeps track of when things are mentioned in the realm of sciences, and they keep track of how often the paper gets tweeted, how often it gets blogged about, how often it appears on Facebook, and it gives you an online score, a score about how well it's being distributed to the masses. And so doing research for this, I found out that having a score of 20 or higher for Altmetric generally represents being in the top 5% of broadcast and accessible manuscripts. And so you can see even here there's some information at the bottom about this particular article, about where it ranks in terms of articles of the same age and articles from that journal. And then if you're thinking about open access journals and publishing open access, so here's 2 studies that I wanted to highlight. The first one on above the black line targets specifically journals that have the ability to publish open access as an extra fee, and then also have their subscription-based regular model as part of that. And so for a lot of these journals, those subscription-based manuscripts become available after 6 months or 12 months, but not all of them. That's not always the case. And so what they found was that there was no statistical difference in the number of citations after 3 years, but in that first year, open access articles tended to have more downloads with a broader reach than the articles that are behind the subscription. And so that might make some sense. These are journals that already have a subscription base. They're maybe journals that people visit and read many manuscripts in the same journal when they visit it. So after that, initial period, when the 6 months or 12 months are up and the publication behind a paywall becomes accessible, and maybe on a longer term doesn't have an impact on citations, but it does have an impact in that first year. The other thing I wanted to talk about in the second study here is the difference between open access versus subscription journals. So these are journals like PLOS ONE, where the journal is completely open the whole time. And so they break this down into open access that don't have a pay model. And so these tend to be smaller journals run by organizations or institutions, and open access where you pay for it, where you treat it like a regular subscription-based journal, and then subscription journals. And so what you can see here, if you're looking at these impact factors for when these journals were launched over certain periods, what you find is that newer journals, both open access and subscription-based, tend to have the same or similar impact factors going forward. And that, if you're looking at this and trying to make some conclusions about this, is that even older subscription-based journals will have, some tend to have a lower impact factor than newer open access paid for journal models. So there doesn't seem to be, there isn't a impact factor for these journals, and in some situations the impact factor may be higher. And so I wanted to, this was a really nice example of all of this that I wanted to kind of highlight to give some aspects of this. So this is a study in Nature Communications by Claire Duvalette. and she performed this meta-analysis of gut microbiome studies to identify shared responses. And so there's all this, there's this actual publication, but there's also this blog that Claire posted called The Empirical Analysis of Microbiome Data Availability, where she made this table, and it's a breakdown of all of the data sources that she was trying to get initially for the meta-analysis. And so the breakdown happens that of the 58 that she was looking to get access to, she was only ever able to get access to 32 of them. Most of those, a majority of them, were in databases and had their metadata available with them in the same database. Sometimes that wasn't the case. Sometimes you had to go to supplemental, other databases. Sometimes she had to go to specific websites to get them off the internet. And then for 5 of those 32, she actually had to email the corresponding authors and get the information. The sad part is there are 26 studies where she just couldn't get the information for it. And so, some of these were in databases, but they lacked the metadata needed to do the meta-analysis. Some of them were just simply emailed the people, because the data wasn't public. Then it becomes this whole back and forth between those people where you either don't get a response, or people stop following up, or they make an argument about how the data is being processed and they're getting there. But it becomes this whole issue of, a large fraction of the data that was, a part of this initial study wasn't available to the researchers. And the real thing to take away is that it's not that this data is some abstract thing. All of this data received funding in some capacity to be generated, and at some point is actually worth real money, right? It's actually worth the cost of entry for these situations. And it would be, and it's really unfortunate that, something that could be on the orders of thousands to $10,000 may only serve one purpose in its entire lifetime, when it can clearly be used by multiple researchers down the road for, even things that are not even directly competitive to the original generation of the data. And so I'm going to start wrapping up here. And so this is a tweet that came from Keith Webster, who's the Dean of Libraries at Carnegie Mellon, but is originally generated by 2 researchers at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Again, this is a hot link to a Google Doc where there are over 400 tools for innovations in scholarly communication. And this just kind of gives you an idea of the types of paths that you could take going through the 6 phases as laid out by these authors of publication, right? Going from data discovery to analysis, writing, publication, outreach, and assessment, and all of the tools that are available, and the plethora of paths that you can take to have very similar impacts along the way of making sure that all of your data, all of your steps are available so that people can not only reproduce it, but get access to it and use it in the future. So I want to leave with a couple of thoughts here. So these are mine. These are my own personal commentary here. So steps for making data management easier. I've broken it down into 2 big segments where I think that people can have problems with. And the first is to avoid that paper submission moment when you realize that you're missing something crucial, or that what you really need are 3 more supplemental tables to actually describe the data in a way that it can be used by somebody else. And so the ways to avoid this are to acknowledge that proper data management have upfront costs and time and energy, but you can normally save those time and energy costs by future, in the future. It's always deferred. It takes a lot of energy to do this, but the deferred benefits happen after the publications come out. The earlier you plan in the life cycle of a project to have good data management, the easier it is. You don't have to backtrack. You're keeping track as you go, and make sure that the information is readily available, not just for yourself if you have to repeat a step, but to make sure that when it gets final time of releasing the publication into the wild, all you have are these very fixed points where you've already logged the data necessary to describe that information. And then one of the maybe more obvious parts of this is start making those supplemental tables early and often. when you get to the end of a section in your project where you're potentially not going to go back to, make a supplemental table that describes how or why you accumulated the data the way you did. Sometimes you might end up using it, sometimes you might not end up using it, but it's important to have those fixed elements so that when you get to the submission part, you can quickly find the data that you need. The other aspect of this is if you can't figure out your process, no one can. And so the best way to think about this is always be documenting and creating files for future you. Don't worry so much about the people who are going to use this after the publication comes out. Do this for you. How many times have you started a project and 2 months later you come back to something that was very early and you knew that you were going to remember it and you don't? Or how many times has somebody asked you a question and you go, oh yeah, I have that on a table somewhere. I'm not sure where that table is. Be your best friend. Make sure that you're doing this type of information, putting this type of information in a place, in a methodology that allows you in the future to get, to be able to repeat your own process. And then the other advice for this would be when you get to a step that you formalize the methodology or finish with the methodology, formalize it, whatever that means. Write it up in Protocols.io, write it up in the manuscript that you're going to write, somewhere where you can fix it, and so that you don't have to worry about trying to retranslate what you've worked on in the past. Okay, and so that's the end of this. I just say in conclusion, in this last tweet from David, who works as part of his career on making open science part of the default. I mentioned benefits for the scientific community, increasing trust in the discipline and better able to build on others, and those for the individual researcher. Citation advantages, reputation benefits, organization, and self-reuse. And so with that, that'll be the end of the webinar, and we can take questions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ben. That was great. I realized I failed to introduce myself at the beginning. So for those who don't know me, I am Stephanie Schrader, and I oversee the Education, Outreach, and Diversity component of C-DEBI and run the professional development webinars. And one thing I wanted to mention was that also if you're looking at broader impacts, educators really love publicly accessible data that they can develop lesson plans with. So with that, Jacob has a question, 2 questions. Ben, let's see, preprints. So bioaccess is popular in biology, but what about not biology? For example, chemical oceanography papers. Where should I preprint those? I've had a paper published in a non-open access journal. And our good legal, our good legal ways for me to provide access to preprints of that paper after it is published. Again, what about non-biology papers?
Sure. So from the aspect of, Jacob's now parsing it out, very good. From the aspect of preprint servers for non-biology papers, I don't know off the top of my head for chemistry. I know PeerJ, which is a more generic journal, their preprints I don't think have specific limitations on the subject matter from it. I have to think, I'm trying to think if I've seen this, that sometimes chemistry papers end up in the archive preprint server, so the preprint server that bioRxiv is based off of. But yeah, I have a very sharp drop off in knowledge when it comes to the preprint servers commonly used for other fields. But to then address the second question, so I have a paper published in a non-open access journal. Are good legal ways for helping me provide access to the preprints of that paper after it is published. So this is journal specific, and it's one of those things where policies change all the time. For a lot of instances, for the journals that allow you to publish preprints before submission to the journal itself, those preprints are open, right? What happens is there are a lot of journals that put limitations on, once it's submitted and you have reviews of the journal, reviews from the journal, comments from the editor, that type of stuff, you can't make further adjustments to the preprint to make it in line with what the final publication will look like. But if you're asking specifically about preprints linked to published papers, those preprints are in the public domain, and I don't think there's any limitation, for the most part, on publicizing them. As for what about papers that are behind paywalls that have preprints, can I share those? Again, that's probably very dependent on the journal you're working with. But in a lot of instances, you probably are running into the problem of you've signed a contract that says that this paper is only accessible when you personally distribute them in some manner. I know there are people who are potentially renegades, who are posting their subscription-based journal manuscripts in things like that are shareable, where you have to directly upload them. So it kind of gets over that hump of you having to share the journal itself, the manuscript itself, in something like ResearchGate. I've seen that happen. But again, it is tricky, and it becomes much more of a legal question of the document that you signed for any particular journal when you did that at the time. And I don't actually know off the top of my head how it would work for non-biology papers.
All right. Gus asks, do you have any thoughts on standardizing an open review process, publishing back and forth with reviewers along with the final manuscript?
Yeah, I have seen this conversation quite frequently. It's if you ever want to start a Twitter fight in science Twitter, come down strong on either side of this question. It's a really good way of just burning bridges and making people angry at you. There are positives and negatives to both sides of this. Having an open peer review process where people are named does have a tendency to make the peer review process much more palatable for the average person. It makes it harder for people to be just outright illogical. It makes it harder for people to say negative, just coming at a paper from a very negative point of view. It kind of self-corrects people into making sure that they're behaving in the way that we probably would ideally want them to behave in the circumstance. On the flip side of all of that, there have been some pretty vocal elements of the overall debate about this, looking at the question of when you have a junior member of the scientific community critiquing somebody who is senior in a level of power, who maybe is making decisions based on in proposals or other submitted manuscripts, and there's a name on it, and it's not a favorable review, not necessarily negative, but not favorable. There's no way of particularly limiting the backlash on that. And the argument could be that as long as it becomes more accepted, that all reviews are public and all names are attached to it, it becomes very hard for those individuals to seek retribution against somebody who gave them a bad review. You would almost need 100% coverage of that kind of policy to have the herd immunity to those type of interactions. So as long as there's the aspect of that, I can understand why there are some caveats about how people are either forcing them to review a paper with their name attached to it, as opposed to maybe still making it a public review without names attached to it. There's definitely benefits to that, and it definitely shows, for the manuscripts that have that, the process and how much more collaborative review processing can be than it has been through the anecdotes of some real horror stories that you can find out there.
All right, if there are not any further questions, which it doesn't look like there are, with that, we will thank Ben. And As I mentioned, this webinar will be recorded and posted shortly.
Thanks for coming by, everybody.